note, this presentation, depressingly, will contain discussions of mistreatment of autistic people and people with intellectual disabilities, discussions of ableism, and mentions of physical harm to staff members. You are welcome to leave this presentation now if any of those things are distressing for you, and you're also welcome to leave the meeting, including if you're in the room, at any point during the presentation for any reason. There are no graphic depictions of things, but just to give everybody a heads up. Secondly, a quick note on language. So language in autism research is complicated and sometimes contentious. I would ask that you please assume good faith on my part with regards to the various language choices that I've made. I don't have time to justify all the wording choices I make as I go along, but I'm happy to take questions about this at the end. I also know that in the room and online, we have people from a lot of different disciplinary backgrounds. So my background is linguistics and then kind of the psychiatry and the psychology. Terms vary a lot between disciplines. So if I'm using a term and you're like, that seems completely unhinged in the context you're using it in, again, you're welcome to ask questions, but just be aware there may be those kind of cross-disciplinary miscommunications going on. So on to the actual research, which is the reason people are here. So the setting for this study was 2-day support services for autistic people with very high support needs. So these are people who need another person with them pretty much constantly in order to support their well-being. Day support services just means that these weren't residential or live-in services. So this was somewhere that the autistic people probably referring to as supported people throughout this presentation, because there were other autistic people involved in the study, including myself and some staff members. So the supported people are the autistic people who are specifically the ones using the service. So the supported people were coming to these services multiple times a week, usually on weekdays between about 9 a.m. and 4 p.m, so kind of roughly analogous to like a school or a work day. And these services provided care and an opportunity for people to do activities, whether that was in the services or out in the community during the day. And I was in and out of these services doing this study for about 25 full days over the course of maybe a year. And between these two services, 21 staff members took part. We didn't collect demographic data formally, but by survey, but I got to know all of these people, and these people were mostly white Scottish and most women. I'm being a bit vague because I'm trying to prevent, identifiability. There was a wide range of ages from people in their teens, so people just really barely out of high school, right up to people in their late 60s and approaching retirement. And although there was a range of socioeconomic backgrounds, staff were predominantly kind of working class, low socioeconomic background and household income, and had limited education. So we're talking people with a secondary school education or sometimes not even completing secondary school. The supported people were all white and mostly men, which is not really surprising given we know what we know about who in the UK is likely to get diagnosed as autistic. They ranged in age from early 20s to mid 40s. And while it was harder to know their socioeconomic backgrounds than staff's, because I didn't really have any contact with parents or guardians, from what I could gather, it was pretty similar to the staff who were working in the service. And these people were mostly on one-to-one support, so that's one staff member at all times with one supported person, although this varied. There were some people who were 2-to-1, so 2 staff members to 1 supported person. There were some small groups of supported people who'd work with 1 or 2 staff members. And because, again, this was an ethnographic study, we weren't collecting IQ or adaptive behaviour scores or whatever. So instead, I'm going to read you 2 fictionalised profiles I put together that hopefully give you an idea of the kind of person I'm talking about when I say supported person for the rest of this presentation. So first off, Kirsty. Kirsty can talk mostly fluently to people about topics she's interested in, which include local politics and cooking. She likes watching the news and will talk in detail to staff about the recent political developments that have been happening. However, she really struggles to answer open-ended or abstract questions. For example, if you say, "How are you feeling today?" or "What did you do yesterday?" she often will either really struggle to respond or just won't answer at all. And sometimes she says things that she doesn't seem to mean. So she'll say yes if you offer her something that she doesn't actually seem to want. She also has articulation difficulties, so difficulties with the production of speech, which means that even when she's talking fluently, it can be quite difficult to understand what she's saying. She can take care of tasks like cleaning herself, making food, and doing chores around the service like gardening or DIY with staff, which she really enjoys. However, she can't write. She will do dangerous things like walk out into traffic if there aren't staff to stop her, and she can't cope with changes to her expected schedule. And if her schedule does change last minute, this often triggers meltdowns, which include self-injurious behaviour. Callum cannot talk. He generally understands staff if they use short, simple sentences supported by pictures and give him plenty of processing time. It's often hard to tell if he hasn't understood something, though, or if he's just ignoring staff because he doesn't like whatever it is they've said to him. He has good fine motor skills for things like colouring or helping staff with cooking food, and can write. However, he struggles with many other tasks, including toileting and showering, and needs staff to help with this. Sometimes he uses writing to communicate, but this is not a reliable form of communication for him. And sometimes he either cannot or will not write. Again, it's quite hard to tell. Staff are mostly reliant on his stimming, his vocalizations, his body language, and his facial expressions to interpret how he's feeling and what he wants. This is really difficult though, as these are very idiosyncratic, and sometimes a specific like stim or facial expression can have multiple meanings. So for example, a high-pitched ee noise with flapping hands can indicate happiness, but it can also mean he's really stressed and close to a meltdown. So there's a lot of contextual work that has to be done there. And this was an ethnographic study, which I've mentioned a couple of times now and not actually explained what that means. So for those of you not familiar with this approach, it's basically hanging around in a particular setting with the goal of using a broad range of kind of qualitative approaches and methodologies, including participant observation and interviews, to get a sense of the setting, the people in that setting, and the sorts of social norms and processes that are happening. So for me, this looked like shadowing staff at the service. I kind of filled a role that was like the closest role available in services to the one that I filled was trainee staff member. I was hanging around with the staff who were providing support. I was assisting where it was appropriate with providing support, and I was interacting with the supported people. And this included informal interviewing, which is basically just having a chat with people, but informal interviewing sounds a lot fancier. And then there were some formal interviews that I conducted at the end of the kind of observational period of the study, with both staff and supported people, although I really hesitate to include the supported people in that because due to aforementioned communication challenges, a lot of the supported people really struggled with answering the interview questions. And all of this left me with over 100,000 words worth of data, including observational notes, reflexive journaling, and interview transcripts. And that doesn't include like photographs I took and documents I collected that were in use at services, etc., which was frankly an enormous amount to sift through. So if you watch this presentation and you're like, seems like she's skimming over some things. I absolutely am, because it's 100,000 words worth of data and I'm going to write a book on this at some point. I used grounded theory for the analysis-ish. Things are always a little bit loosey-goosey with ethnography. So that means that I collected and analysed the data semi-simultaneously. So I was collecting data, I was going home, I was having to think about it, I was going back to collect more data, going home, having to think about it. I was looking for codes and concepts and stuff. I was making notes of those codes and concepts in memos, and then using this analysis to iteratively shape the kinds of data I was collecting and the kinds of things I was looking for when I was in services. And then when I was finished with data collection, I did repeated rounds of coding to get the core concepts of the analysis that I'm going to talk about in a moment. And our guiding interests in this study, which is what we used instead of research questions, because we were like, if we ask specific questions, inevitably we will get answers to different questions. So maybe this way we'll get something at least approximately close to what we're looking for. Our guiding interests that shaped the analysis were, one, to characterise relations between staff and supported people. So where do misunderstandings arise between staff and supported people? And what do these tell us about different frameworks like double empathy problem, neurodiversity, and deficit models of autistic social communication? Two, to characterise relations between the supported people. So how do they interact and communicate with one another? And is there overlap with things that we see with lower support needs autistic people? So is there kind of continuity of behaviour across the entirety of the autistic population? And three, to understand the primarily non-autistic staff's perspectives on the supported people and their social communication. I was especially interested in how these diverged from my perspectives as an autistic researcher and from the few autistic staff members that there were perspectives, and what this could tell us about, again, similarities between autistic people with different levels of support needs. Additionally, for the analysis, I use something called composite narrative techniques, and essentially this means that the vignettes and quotes I use in this presentation are not actually verbatim, they're fictionalized, though they still draw on the data to produce something grounded in truth and reality for whatever given definition of truth and reality you want to use. You've already seen this in action with those two profiles I used earlier, and I took this approach for two reasons. First, because it provides a degree more protection to the participants than just pseudonymizing them does. It makes them much harder to identify because any quotes or actions are a composite of multiple individuals. And because the setting I was working in was quite small and specific, and people within those settings had very specific characteristics or behaviours, there's a really substantial risk of identification and potential harm to participants here. And secondly, a lot of my analysis draws on multiple conversations or events that happen days or weeks apart from each other because I was in services for such a long period of time. And composite narrative means that rather than saying, here's one data extract, and then 3 weeks later, here's another data extract, and then at the end, I interviewed someone and to illustrate my point, I can instead present a single scenario that kind of merges all of those things into one kind of illustrative vignette. So onto the more interesting bit, the findings. Now you understand what it is that I've done. So the 4 core concepts I pull out of this analysis are parts of a larger whole, fear and control, friends, favourites and coexistence, and who are we, who are they? I'll go through each of these and the various subcomponents of them in turn, and then I'll talk a little bit about the overall theory or narrative that these collectively produce about staff and supported people's relations in care context, and B, about how they address the guiding interests that I talked about. So first off, parts of a larger whole. This concept is essentially about the fact that actually what happens inside services is really only a small part of a much wider set of contexts, especially in these non-residential settings where people come in for a short period of time and then leave and then come back again. And these external contexts have a huge influence on supported people's moods, behaviours and well-being, which obviously then impacts a lot on how things unfold within the services. The key context I found in this study was supported people's histories, so where they'd been before this service, their past experiences. The stuff that happens outside services, so at home, how their parents and other carers are treating them, their health, and also the physical environment of the building that the service is housed in, which the services often don't have a ton of control over. And to illustrate that, here's our first vignette. So Caitlin has taken herself off to a sensory tent for a nap. She didn't sleep at all last night and has been irritable all morning because of it. Brian takes the opportunity to tell me a bit about her past. She was in this completely inappropriate service before. Everyone in the same room, loads of noise, bright lights, multiple TVs blaring, staff barely paying attention. She'd hurt herself or staff because of it. It took months for her to start recovering from that after she came here. Then it's time for lunch. We go sit in the kitchen and light is streaming in through the windows. The chairs screech against the floors, and Freddie, who likes to stim really loudly, is also in the room. Caitlin has it in her support plan that she's sound sensitive, but staff don't want her getting reliant on ear defenders. So she's given the option to either have lunchtime be over or to stay and eat. She stays because she's hungry and wants to eat, but by the time she's finished her lunch, she's so stressed that she's trying to hit Brian. And these contextual influences aren't limited to the supported people either. So staff experienced financial hardship, employment precarity, health issues, and other life circumstances that place huge emotional and empathic drains on them outside of work. These left them burned out and struggling to be emotionally available during their work, which was a really important aspect of the care that they were providing. The services themselves often didn't have enough money. They had a high staff turnover, so they were losing a lot of staff expertise and bringing in a lot of very young staff with not a lot of life experience. They couldn't afford to pay staff enough, and they didn't have enough staff in services at any given moment to make it safe for everybody and make it optimally safe for everybody. And these things also inevitably had a massive impact on both staff and supported people's experiences in the service. So Katie is sick with a nasty cough. She doesn't think it's COVID, but she doesn't have access to a chest to check. She's tired because she was coughing so much last night that it was hard to sleep. She's coughing a lot today too and is not wearing a mask. The person she's working with, Albert, has a history of chest infections, which, because Albert can't communicate what he's feeling in his body, even with assisted and augmentative communication, they're often not caught until they're fairly advanced and he's in a lot of pain and very distressed. Other staff are worried about catching whatever bug it is that Katie's got, though no one mentions Albert's health. Jessica mentions to Katie that maybe she should have taken the day off, but Katie points out that they're already down 2 staff members. Albert should be on 2-to-1, so 2 staff members to 1 supported person, but it's just her with him today. She also can't financially afford to take the day off. Her energy company is threatening to switch off her electricity if she doesn't pay her bills, but she's already in her overdraft. And she's an agency worker, so she doesn't get paid time off either. The next concept is fear and control, which is about staff's fear of supported people and their responses to that fear and how this drives and alters practice. So the most important aspect of this concept is what I describe as a mutual hostage situation. So staff have institutional power over the supported people at the service. Supported people were dependent on them for a wide variety of basic needs. Staff have the ability to stop supported people from accessing food or toys, or prevent them from doing activities, or to do things that upset or distress the supported people if they decided to. This left supported people at the mercy of staff. But staff were in some ways also at the mercy of the supported people. Staff were not physically violent to the supported people, and they quite rightly regarded that as an abhorrent thing to do. But supported people could be physically violent. They had the potential to physically hurt others when distressed or angry or annoyed. And there were 2 sorts of pathways this played out with, depending on how staff decided to apportion blame or intent for this physical threat. And this is the first one, which I call fear, no intent, and grief. A staff member tells me, Heather had had some stuff going on at home. I knew that. And she phoned me one day after things had happened at home and she said, I just can't cope today. I said, don't worry, I'll go in today. It was my day off, but I was like, I am not letting her in, not in her state. And she's older than me too. If I get punched in the face, I'll come out with a bruise maybe. If she gets punched in the face, it could seriously damage her, a broken bone. And her mental state was already bad enough, you know. And it's sad because the guy she was supposed to be working with, he's like a brother to me. He's like a little brother. But I still got to watch my back because he could turn around and beat me up. He doesn't mean it. I don't think he means it. I hope he doesn't mean it. But he could. And people say, oh, you're just a carer or you're just a support worker. And they minimise because you don't need to have any skills to start with, you know. But you need to have the heart to do it. You need to have compassion. It's hard. It's really hard. Sometimes I see things and I think I just want to run away. And this is the second pathway that I call fear, intent, and control. So Johnny, who has only been here a few months, tells me, I really struggled when I came here with not being able to give the people a choice. You can give them a choice between puzzles, for example, but not their activities. You can't say, what do you want to do? But then I realised it's all been worked out years ago, what's best for them. I interpreted this initially as the supported people get overwhelmed when presented with too many choices, which is indeed something autistic people can struggle with. But the next day, Samira, who's been here for 10 years, puts it differently. We can't let supported people do something once because then they'll want to do it all the time. When I probe about this, she says this is about getting people used to things and about asserting control. If they don't see staff as authority figures, they start pushing boundaries and thinking they can say no to things. That's when things go wrong. I had to explain to Johnny the other day that he can't change things with them without thinking they can change things with him. This second pathway led to an escalation of this hostage situation. Staff's institutional power over supported people meant that when staff felt physically threatened, they could turn to authoritarian measures, so they could restrict someone's behaviour or deny them food to reassert a feeling of control over the situation, often further distressing the supported people and making them more likely to hit out, which led to a greater threat to staff's safety. The more staff attempted to control and or punish supported people, the more supported people became frightened and stressed, and therefore the potential for them to hit out at staff increased. But the more that staff experienced physical threat from the supported people, the more staff became frightened and tried to manage that fear and risk via control and punishment. Linked to this fear was staff's misinterpretation of the service's low arousal approach policy. So the low arousal approach, if you're not familiar with it, is an approach that emphasises reducing demands on small supported people, avoiding triggers for distress, and trying to avoid anything that might escalate situations. In my opinion, at its core, without knowing tons about it and how it's used, it's a fairly reasonable set of principles. But under staff's fear-based practice, however, this became an aversion for supported people displaying any strong emotions or change from what staff described as baseline, so this kind of neutral mood state. So not only was anger or distress considered frightening and potentially dangerous, but excitement and enthusiasm was too. This fear also stopped staff from reflecting on what they were doing and why. Because risk of physical injury was a constant concern for staff, and because many supported people found routine changes stressful, staff internalised the idea that it was important to keep everything the same forever. This running through the motions was a sort of protective talisman, and any change to the way things were done risked causing issues, even when this insistence itself was actually the thing causing the issues. So Kieran keeps indicating he doesn't want to go into the sensory room. Jane insists, though, because it's on his schedule. If I follow the schedule and I make sure Kieran stays on task, that means there'll be fewer incidents. He really needs his routine, otherwise he gets upset. She tries bribing him with food to make him go into the sensory room, and then persuading him by saying it will make her happy if he goes. Eventually, she threatens him with time alone in his room to regulate if he doesn't. Kieran does go eventually, but he's agitated the whole time we're in the sensory room. He's just showing off because you're here, Jane says, and then tells him loudly and repeatedly to calm down. After the sensory room, we immediately rush on to the next task on the schedule, even though Kieran seems overwhelmed, agitated, and disoriented. This continues for the rest of the day. When Kieran hits out at Jane later, she seems surprised and also upset. I don't know where that came from, she says, as another two staff take Kieran back to his room for time to regulate. We were having such a good day up until now. It's so hard to work out what sets them off sometimes. And finally, linked to these concepts was the rapidity and the power of staff institutionalisation. So newcomers to the service, including myself, rapidly picked up on correct ways to behave from existing staff. The urgency of assimilating with the way things are done was underscored by this sense of fear I've just outlined. So new staff and myself were made to feel that changing the way that things were done would have potentially catastrophic results for both the staff and the supported people. Established staff members also talked to one another about toughening up newer staff, often by deliberately exposing them to upsetting or dangerous circumstances. Newer staff were often traumatised by this initially, and then seemed to develop a sort of loss of compassion by way of protecting themselves in these circumstances. In this way, new staff's training and empathy towards supported people was systematically subsumed beneath the often outdated established norms of the service. These established norms often focused on normalising supported people's behaviour and appearances and communicating in ways that often cut off opportunities for connection and communication between staff and supported people. But on a brighter note after that horrendous 10 minutes, despite this, there was still room for communication and connection between staff and supported people, which is what this concept, friends, favourites and coexistence, is about. So supported people clearly had staff that they preferred interacting with and had individual social preferences. This was especially obvious when it came to me coming into services. So some supported people really liked me straight out the gate. Some of them liked me after they warmed up to me. And some of them, after a year of getting used to me, were still like, I just don't want anything to do with you. Which I found quite charming, actually. I was always really pleased when someone was like, no. Staff also had supported people who were their favourites. And a lot of staff said that they developed favourites and friends amongst the supported people, similar to how they picked friends outside the service. So people talked about shared sense of humours, good banter between them and the supported person, or shared interests. Though they also said it often took longer to develop a relationship with supported people than with non-autistic people. So there was this kind of warming up phase. And the depths of these relationships could be seen in the ways that staff just got supported people, especially those they were particularly close to, and in the ways that they ended up changing their behaviour and communication to be more like the supported persons. So Chiara comes into the service this morning full of energy. "A boo-boo," she announces loudly, coming into the kitchen and waving. "A boo-boo. You've got your blue ball with you today," says Miriam. "That's great. We can play with that in the park when we go for a walk if you'd like." "Babbe," says Chiara firmly. Miriam shakes her head. "No, gardening's on a Tuesday, isn't it, Chiara?" she says. "What's today?" "Ma," says Chiara, and holds up her coat, shaking it. "Up." "Monday, yeah," says Miriam. "Good job. We've worked really hard on our days of the week," she says to me. "You going to go hang your coat up, Chiara? And then we can have our cup of tea before morning meeting." "Bah," says Chiara, and Bunny hops off to hang her coat up. "Bah," calls Miriam after her and smiles. It's always a good day when you're working with Chiara. She's my favourite. Not that we're supposed to have favourites, of course, but everyone does. Staff and supportive people did not always manage to communicate well with one another, though. Staff were often distressed when these communication failures happened and would frequently blame themselves for the miscommunications. Supportive people were often visibly frustrated as well when they were clearly trying to communicate something and staff were or myself weren't understanding, and were often remarkably gracious about repeating themselves 4, 5, 6 times that it took for either myself or staff to get what they were trying to say. And these miscommunications could make maintaining these staff-supported person relationships hard. One of the ways staff seemed to cope with these communication difficulties was by what I call inventing a person, creating, collaboratively with other staff, a personality to project onto the supported person. Often this persona was kind of rooted in actual traits or behaviours of the supported person, but these were then exaggerated, elaborated on, and kind of interpreted into by staff. So I'm in the kitchen having coffee, chatting to Dinesh and Alice, when Rob appears in the doorway. He's just arrived. "You got your glasses on today, Holly," he says by way of greeting. He says this to me a lot, even when I very obviously have my glasses on, and it seems to be his version of hi. "I do," I say, and I tap them right here on my head. "Hi, Rob." "You're in a good mood this morning, Rob, aren't you?" says Dinesh. "I'm away the mood," says Rob, ducking his head in the living room. I don't blame him. It's quite noisy in here with the three of us chatting, and Katie, another supported person, is in the corner stimming loudly and giggling to herself over her tea. "He does get all shy like that sometimes," says Dinesh thoughtfully. "It's so funny. He's such a funny guy." "Aye, he's shy because there's a pretty new lady in the service," says Alice and laughs. "He's a bit of a ladies' man, Rob is. I think if he wasn't, like he is, then he'd be a bit of a player." "Oh yeah," says Dinesh and laughs too. "Breaking hearts left, right and centre he would be." And sociality and socialising in services was also a site of both conflict and negotiation between staff and supported people. For non-autistic staff, the service was a workplace and therefore a place that they could socialise with co-workers. Autistic staff found this difficult as they then had to try and fit in with neurotypical social norms, and supportive people often found it difficult too. They sometimes did not like the sensory impact of other people talking in the same room as them, and were often left out of or disinterested in staff discussions that kind of went above their heads. So stuff about finances or family or personal hobbies that weren't of interest to a supportive person. They could become frustrated and wanted staff to pay attention to them rather than to each other, especially if it was a staff member that was working with them that particular day. However, even though supported people often had to accommodate staff's social and communicative preferences in this way, staff often didn't accommodate supported people's. For example, they'd get frustrated when supported people talked about the same thing all the time. However, staff often did display a range of behaviours I would describe as becoming autistic. So they mimicked autistic people's stims back at them or used their gestalts, their phrases, to communicate with them. And they ended up more mirroring supported people's behaviour or body language in really interesting ways. And finally, who are we and who are they? And this one draws a lot more heavily from the formal interviews I did at the end of my fieldwork, where I talked to primarily to staff, also to supported people, but I've already mentioned that, about their perspectives on their work and on their relations to the supported people that they were working with. So staff characterise the supported people as either just like anyone else, or as entirely different to neurotypical people and therefore kind of fundamentally unknowable. And these characterizations were deployed really flexibly, depending on which best justified staff's actions or beliefs in that specific moment. For example, autistic people were just like everybody else when staff wanted to comfort somebody through touching them, or when it came to applying conventional understandings of communication or body language to them. However, autistic people were completely alien when it confused staff or when it was convenient to think so. So autistic people displayed behaviour rather than interacting with or reacting to their environment, emotions, or other people. They wouldn't notice if staff ignored them, lied to them, or attempted to distract them from something they were focused on. And they were framed as going away somewhere when they became internally rather than externally preoccupied. Obviously, all these things were wrong. People do notice if you lie to them, even if they have profound learning disabilities. But this was the staff's perspective on things. So here are some different staff's kind of framings of the supported people they were working with. So Sally says, a lot of the ways I relate to and engage with the supported people is stuff I do with colleagues too. So I don't think there's that much difference between them and us. We're all human at the end of the day, you know. Caroline says they've got completely different brains to us. They're adults with incapacity, but they're also adult men. It's a difficult line to tread. You sometimes find yourself wanting to treat them like kids, but no, they're not. Sometimes it's really clear they're not. Mark says, I feel like I understand some of the stuff that the guys do, because I'm like that too, with the routine and the textures and stuff. You know, since coming to work here, I've wondered if I'm a bit on the spectrum myself, actually. Don't tell the other stuff I said that, though. And Ariana says, that could be any of us if we were unlucky. You know, even the adults with degrees and jobs, the ones that are high functioning, they just can't cope with things. They have their own way of doing things and they can only do it that way. It's very sad. Another aspect of relational confusion between staff and supported people was role confusion. So staff and supported people seemed really unsure of the roles that they played in one another's lives. Staff often describe themselves as friends when talking to the supported people, so they say, I'm your friend. But when talking to me, staff said they were not supposed to have friends or favourites amongst the supported people. They also struggled with the contradiction between their role as an employee paid to care for somebody and with the genuine friendships that naturally emerged with the supported people as a result of providing that care. There was this kind of complexity inherent in being someone's paid friend, basically. Staff also struggled to reconcile the ways in which supported people were childlike, either in their behaviours or interests or support needs, with the ways in which they were visibly and obviously adult, so in terms of physicality and in terms of sexual interest. So Jeffrey has a sign on his wall that says, staff are Jeffrey's friends. Mark reminds him of that throughout the day, tapping the sign. Mark is Jeffrey's friend. He's here to help Jeffrey have a good day. Jeffrey needs to behave so we can have a good day, okay? Or Mark will be sad. When I'm chatting to Mark later, though, he says staff are not supposed to have friends or favourites amongst the supported people. Despite this, he tells me in an almost conspiratorial tone of voice that Catherine is his favourite person to work with. He considers her a friend, and he hopes she considers him a friend too, although he's not sure. She's got a great sense of humour, he says, very dry, just like his, and they like the same cartoons. He gets worried when she gets too handsy with him sometimes. She really likes hugging people and stroking their hair. He has to remind her that's not appropriate. Staff are required to tell Catherine that touching people like that is for family members only, even if they are personally okay with being hugged. That being said, he says, there's a bit of me that feels like she's a daughter to me, you know. If anything happened to her mum and dad, I'd adopt her in a heartbeat. And the final issue here is the dilemma of who got to speak for the supported people. Supported people's capacity for sustained advocacy or reflective decision making. So not just do you want toast or cereal, but like having broader long-term life decisions. So stuff about their environment, their schedules and their meals was limited. And this meant that many aspects of their decisions had to be made, or at least partially, and supported by somebody who was not the supported person. What was not clear, however, is who should get to make these decisions, who got to be considered an expert. Staff who'd been with the service a long time were often considered de facto experts by other staff. They had a huge amount of knowledge about the supported people, but they were often also powerfully institutionalised and could be very outdated in their practices and understandings. New staff members were less institutionalised and had loads of fresh new ideas and a new pair of eyes, but they could be too eager to change aspects of practice without understanding the ramifications of those changes or why those aspects of the practice were in place. And autistic people who were not the supported people, so especially autistic staff members, but other people talked about reading blogs online or following autistic people on Twitter, could provide valuable insight into what autism was like. But this didn't necessarily mean that they actually knew what was going on in the supported people's heads or what they wanted. And staff felt that they could sometimes project their own preferences as an autistic person onto a supported person who had different needs and preferences. So I think to summarize this, the kind of thesis statement, as you will, relationships between staff and supported people in services are part of a larger whole. Supported people's care histories, their life and experiences outside of the service, and the physical environment of the service all massively influence attitudes, mood, and behaviour when supported people are in services. Likewise, the personal circumstances of staff, primarily the personal financial precarity of staff, but also general precarity of the services, finances, and staff levels, impacted staff's well-being, mood, and emotional availability. The huge influence of contextual factors on service relations meant that services were sometimes dominated by fear and control. Staff were afraid of supported people's perceived unpredictability and capacity to cause them physical harm. They sometimes managed this fear through tightening their control of the service and particularly their control of the supported people, which understandably and very naturally upset the supported people. And this could produce a vicious cycle of deteriorating staff-supported person relations, as well as a strong culture within the service that promoted rapid institutionalisation of new staff and a lack of intellectual curiosity or innovation of practice. Despite this potential for hostility, though, positive relations also flourished in the service. Staff found friends, favourites, and coexistence amongst the people they were supporting through forming connections, smoothing over points of disconnection, and negotiating social differences, though these negotiations were almost always weighted in staff's favour. In general, staff's reflections on the relational elements of their job were dominated by uncertainty and questions. Who are we? Who are they? Were supported people the same as or entirely different from staff? Were the staff's roles in relation to the supported? What were staff's roles in relation to the supported people? And whose expertise should be used to guide care provision when the supported people struggle to self-advocate for themselves? So what conclusions can we draw from this quickly? Well, we can draw a lot of different conclusions, to be honest. But to pull this back to the beginning of the presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about how this analysis addresses some of our guiding themes. And I'm going to address these first two together because there's not a lot to say about the second one, and also because it's tangled up with the first. So staff genuinely cared for supported people. The ethnography paints a rich and nuanced portrait of staff and supported people who genuinely care for one another and often develop close relationships outside the scope of typical working or service provider relationships. These relationships emerged despite mutual difficulties in understanding and relating to one another and communicating with one another, and despite these issues with fear, control, and role confusion that we've talked about. It's harder to know what supported people think, either about staff or about other supported people, because at least the supported people I was working with, you couldn't just ask them. Even supported people who could talk semi-fluently about special interests or specific topics really struggled when I started asking about friendships and stuff. So there was one person who I'd had multiple conversations with, and when I said, "Can you tell me who your friends are in the service?" stood there for 15 minutes staring at me and mumbling quietly to himself, and eventually said no. What is clear is that supported people do have relationships with staff, and they have clear preferences for certain staff based on things like shared interests, personality, compatibility, staff's behaviour towards them, and also whether a staff is autistic or not. Supported people's relationships with one another are, again, hard to comment on. The supported people mostly interacted with staff and sometimes avoided other supported people because their stimming wasn't compatible with that person's specific sensory needs. But there were still relationships between supported people, albeit ones that were often highly subtle and non-normative in their experience, in their appearance. For example, two supported people described as close friends by staff displayed this friendship through A, being in the same room together with one person following another if they left the room, and B, by one person waiting for the other person to start eating at meal times. And these sorts of interactions only started to become apparent to me as a newcomer to the service towards the end of the ethnography, as they require a massive degree of like one-to-one individual familiarity with the people before you can start seeing these very kind of subtle relational interactions. And this is an area I'd really like to see more work in, and or to do some more work in myself, though I think there are kind of some obvious really major ethical and methodological challenges here. And the double empathy problem, though, which I'm just realising now, I don't actually know whether everyone knows what the double empathy problem is. The double empathy problem is something by Damien Milton, who's an autistic sociologist / philosopher, that says in the same way that non-autistic people struggle to understand, and the same way autistic people struggle to understand non-autistic people's social communication, non-autistic people also struggle to understand autistic people's social communication. So it reframes social communication difficulties in autism as not the fault of the autistic person, but this kind of dispositional mismatch, as Milton calls it. It's a lot more nuanced than that, but that's the CliffsNotes version. So this is still clearly alive and well in social care contexts, even though it's previously only been looked at in autistic people with lower support needs. And this double empathy problem can occur between autistic people with high support needs and non-autistic staff. Staff struggle to take on supported people's perspectives, to understand their communication, and they often applied neuronormative assumptions when attempting to reason about supported people's preferences or behaviours. This also leads nicely into our third guiding interest, so staff's perspectives on supported people and their social communication. Oh gosh, we're running over. Last like 3 slides, I promise. Staff also openly discussed in interviews their difficulty in understanding what was going on in supported people's heads. So their perspective was often that miscommunication was a mutual issue, so staff's inability to understand supported people was as much a problem with staff as it was with supported people's communication differences. However, this perspective varied a lot depending on staff member, and also depending on like time and context within individual staff members. And there were other less relational understandings, more tied to deficit understandings of autism. So, you know, autism is a mystery, it's a puzzle, people do things because they're autistic, but who's to say why they do them, kind of stuff. Staff's accounts also interestingly suggest that, as we said, autistic staff maybe have an advantage in understanding supported people's behaviour and taking their perspectives. And this suggests experiential commonalities of autistic experience, regardless of level of support needs. It also suggests that involving autistic people, including those with lower support needs, in the process of planning and providing care to higher support needs autistic people who may or may not be able to self-advocate is valuable as part of a broad coalition of experts that should include professionals, parents, long-term carers and current care staff, and other people with different and distributed types of knowledges about A, autism, but B, about the specific individual in question. And finally, autistic people with high support needs and their social communication puts a strain on the double empathy problem and the neurodiversity paradigm in interesting ways. Misunderstandings during this study due to the double empathy problem did occur, as I've just mentioned, but a lot of misunderstandings were due to people having little or no language, having articulation difficulties, and sometimes a sense that the supported people themselves were not always clear on what it was they were trying to communicate. And this foregrounds a question that currently cuts through a number of fissures in the autism research community. Namely, if someone who is autistic cannot communicate either with words or with assisted and augmentative communication methods, is this due to autism or is it due to intellectual disability which co-occurs with autism? And I don't have an answer for this, and that's not what this study was trying to answer, but I do want to emphasise that what I pulled from this study is that any attempt to answer this question should not simply displace this deficit versus difference debate off of autism and into the realm of intellectual disability. We need a neurodiversity paradigm that can account for genuine communication difficulties, whether those are in autistic or in intellectually disabled people, without ceding ground on the fact that these difficulties do not make somebody any less human or deserving of respect. Thank you for listening. Sorry we ran over. Thanks to the services and everybody in them, without whom this research would not have been possible, and who gave up a tremendous amount of time and patience to allow me in. I really appreciate the expertise and the time that they gave me. Thank you also to my supervisors, Joe and Sue and Catherine. Those are my contact details, and I think this is probably time for questions.